Hi, my name is Dr. Cynthia Elise Smith. This is the presentation for my dissertation defense, originally presented on May 1st, 2018, entitled Writing While Black: Exploring Perceptions of African American Writing in the 21st Century. I would like to begin by quoting the famous writer, poet, and Black activist James Baldwin, who wrote, "Any writer, I suppose, feels that the world into which he was born is nothing less than a conspiracy against the cultivation of his talent, which attitude certainly has a great deal to support it. On the other hand, it is only because the world looks on his talent with such frightening indifference that the artist is compelled to make his talent important." The famed poet Langston Hughes wrote, "Will my page be colored that I write? I wonder if it is that simple." The questions that he asks are as poignant today as they were in 1939, in that the suggestion of identity as colored or African American might be revealed in his writing. Is it really as simple as taking a pen to paper in 1939 or typing into a computer today that one's race would become the words on the pages as well? According to Donald Rubin, 1995, essential paradoxes of composing was essentially that writing is both cognitive and individual in terms of process, simultaneously with being social and conventional in practice. Style is a function of a writer's idiosyncratic identity, as well as being a working part of a social environment where the writer and the writing are both entrenched, and that a reflection as well as the creation of a writer's identity is inherent in the writer's written language. He further stated that while there is no doubt that a writer's personality determines his or her style or rhetorical choices, certain stylistic options may lead clues that may reveal a writer's social identity. Writing styles for African Americans, therefore, may in effect lead clues to the racial identity of the writer. We already know that writing is one of the most important ways that individuals use language to render thoughts and ideas and to express those thoughts and ideas to others, second only to speaking, and that biographers, philosophers, educators, novelists, essayists, screenwriters, journalists, poets, and others who make a living through writing shape the various discourses that have existed for thousands of years, as well as today in American culture. Writing has contributed to the successful professional careers of millions of people in the arts and has advanced pedagogy and research, policy, and practice in the academy. Graduates of English and writing programs at colleges and universities who enter the various fields of writing and journalism have the potential to make countless important contributions within American society. Hanifa Barnes, a contemporary American writer in this century, wrote of her concern of how she felt she was perceived as a writer. Was I too white or too black? Did I use the right word choice? Was my subject and verb agreement intact? While the gist of the article she wrote was on language, the impetus to write the way one speaks and the concern for identity perception and acceptance is a reality for African American writers. Ms. Barnes stated a concern that is echoed by many African Americans in terms of perception, that minorities tend to adjust speech and behavior to fit the situation in order to avoid profiling and negative perceptions. Indeed, Ms. Barnes believed that the ability to code switch was a masterful skill and a delicate balancing act. Now, why would Ms. Barnes hold the perception of her writing to the extent that she felt she had to maintain a certain vigilance in producing the right word choices and a consistent cognizance of her grammar? Well, when we understand that the importance of writing as an expression of our thoughts and ideas, and we understand that writing has contributed to the successful professional careers of millions of people in the arts, we have to ask ourselves why writers like James Baldwin held the sentiments that they did. When we realize that in education, writing has advanced pedagogy and research, policy and practice in the academy, and that graduates of English and writing programs at colleges and universities who enter the various fields of writing and journalism have the potential to make countless important contributions within American society, we have to consider perceptions that are held in the mainstream about the contributions made by African Americans in this regard. What is it like to be an African American writer in the United States today? Who even asks that question? How are African American writers perceived in the mainstream? Who even cares? And why would they? I have asked myself these questions and found that there weren't any specific answers to be found, except among anecdotal reflections of African American writers themselves, some long past, and all of whom I would never have had the pleasure and honor of an engaging discourse on the subject. As a student of writing studies in graduate school, the experience was a series of situational proving grounds where my writing was most often at issue in terms of its authenticity or qualification by my professors. Sometimes compliments on my writing were followed by the caveats that I must have had help or had not written the work myself. Essentially, my writing was scrutinized, in my view, more stringently than my Caucasian cohorts, and the constant need for validation through external sources was consistently applied to my papers. Now, I'm not referring to academ's requirement for referential proofs. No, I am referring to the kind of validation derived from the use of words that I have come to differentiate as softeners, such as may, should, probably, and might, as replacements for more assertive words like is, are, and definitely. One of the major lessons I learned in my writing studies program was that the use of these softening words allowed me to write without a shred of personal authority and still retain the context of my thesis, albeit to the exclusion of my dignity at times. My doctoral program experience was not very different from my graduate experience. In writing for my coursework and even my IRB proposal and dissertation, I found that when I opted for these softener words, they were treated as more acceptable choices and less likely to be overly scrutinized or requiring additional qualification and validation for my writing to be determined credible. I came to realize that my use of more assertive wording implied a perception of credibility and acceptance still foreign enough and too far between the acceptance that I should consider for myself, even after having attained the credential as a master in the subject of writing from St. Joseph's University, summa cum laude. So, what is the purpose of a study like this? To explore whether there are differences in African American writing that are based on attitudes which are influenced by perceptions that stem from personal beliefs, cultural biases, and racial stereotypes of African Americans. To explore whether the possibility exists that perceptions of African Americans in general are what drive attitudes of African American writing, and whether perceptions and attitudes from history persist in the 21st century with regard to African American writing. Finally, and just as important, to draw attention to the importance of African American writing in American discourse. Research questions were: are there differences in the way African Americans write than mainstream or Caucasian writing? How are African American writers perceived And are perceptions of African American writing based on attitudes that may stem from historical and or contemporary racial biases, personal beliefs, social and or racial stereotypes in the 21st century? Does racial identity drive perceptions and attitudes of African American writing? In short, the intent was to raise awareness of how important perceptions are to acceptance and efficacy of African American writing and to ignite more scholarly research into the subject of race and African American writing in the 21st century and beyond. But there were limitations to the study that cannot be dismissed. Perceptions of African American writing are not studied in abundance. Most of the scholarly research available lends itself to linguistics and African American vernacular English and dialects. Most of the relevant literature relates to linguistics and language of African Americans, and most studies and research on writing relates to composition and pedagogy, or writing in general, and not specifically perceptions of African American writing from any standpoint, other than as comparisons for empirical studies on the abilities of particular groups. Although diligence was applied to ensure the adequate representation of the target survey population, the study used writers' organizations and readers who are members of book clubs, and not all conceivable clubs or organizations were solicited. As a result, the data might not be considered general to the mass population. Personal writing experiences gained through interviews provide anecdotal information, and while many may provide some shared experiences, these responses are not capable of capturing the full breadth of experiences and perceptions, feelings, and the impact on African American writers who write for a living and are therefore personal and speculative. Although perceptions of some noted African American writers are discussed in the dissertation, the overall effects of their perceptions and the perceptions of African Americans as a whole are outside of the scope of this study. Whether perceptions of African American writing are due to historically racial and or cultural biases, stereotypes, or simply differences in preferences not related to race are not easily determined because of their subjectivity and because while many might be similar and might be born out of a particular culture or ideology, they are still the product of the individual's own decision to embrace those thoughts and ideas. These issues and the question of whether racial identity affects perceptions of African American writing from mainstream writing are almost impossible to ascertain without an adequate amount of scientific and other scholarly research on the subject. The survey was limited in that most of the respondents were college educated and in some cases beyond the bachelor's degree level. The majority of respondents held views consistent with the Democratic Party, with only a few who identified with the Republican Party. Therefore, it can be concluded that most of the respondents were more liberal or progressive than conservative in their views relative to race. Writing is the symbolic representation of linguistics. Bloomfield wrote in his 1933 work Language that, quote, words are the linguistic units first symbolized in writing, end quote. These symbols in the form of characters are, quote, features of the writer's language, end quote. Since most of the scholarly literature deals with language and linguistics, I discovered through Bloomfield's examination of linguistics, language, and writing that because all three are so closely meshed, his explanation was an excellent way of tying the scholarly research literature of African American linguistics and language to writing for the study. Davilia 2012 stated that even though there is no inherent link between race and dialect, when one dialect is both read as white and deemed more acceptable than other dialects, it becomes racist in the reader's mind and perpetuates whiteness. De Villiers' statement understood that while there is no link between one's race and dialect, a reader might consider that if what is written using a dialect is considered white, it is therefore considered more acceptable than other dialects. The question then becomes, what exactly is a white dialect? That is an interesting and thoughtful question, but beyond the scope of this study. It is, however, certainly a question that should spark more scholarly study of the effects of dialects and race in African American writing. De Villiers 2012 discussed indexicality as the creation of semiotic links between linguistic forms and social meanings, and that indexicality can have a negative impact on identity since there is a potential for it to be used as linguistic profiling or stereotyping, and even to the extent of justifying inequality or perpetuating oppression. De Villiers' research indeed suggested that readers do look for clues about writers' identities. During the era of increased study about African American vernacular English compared to standard American English language today, there continues to be the perception among scholars and American culture of African Americans and AAVE as, quote, attached to the inferiority of all things black, end quote. Ronkin and Carn, 1999, suggested that racial biases and stereotypes with regard to Ebonics and AAVE were driven by the same stereotypes and biases that affect the lives of African Americans overall. While this study includes a scholarly review of literature, there are African American writers and authors also important to include, since their own individual and unique brand of experiences tell the story of the African American writing life and its relationship to race in America in a way that enhances the scholarly literature and explanations in the study. Author L.J. Alonge wrote in an NPR opinion called Code Switching, Race and Identity Remixed. It is no secret that the stories we tell are important. They give shape to our experiences. They document our humanity. They cultivate our sense of possibility. But I realize now that I'd underestimated the mental work that telling your story actually takes. The kind of sustained effort needed to resist everything this country tells you about how marginalized or unimportant you are without the white gaze. Throughout this study, it was important to represent the research in the most credible way possible, given its subjectivity and controversial nature. Ms. Toni Morrison's written contributions to the discourse of African American life and the struggle for racial equality, equity, and justice provided a rich source of reliable, relevant information for this study, both in terms of the African American writing life, as well as life as an African American living in a racialized America. Ms. Morrison exemplifies the duality of a writer living within the mainstream and as a Black writer, a duality that cannot be ignored. Furthermore, she is the personification of the value that lies within that duality. So because of this exemplification, I decided that her voice was the strongest in terms of the context of the study, the relevancy of it, and the importance of the subject for future research. Her novels are only rivaled by her prolific quotes on the subject of race and African American writing. 3 such quotes are, when does racial unconsciousness or the awareness of race enrich interpretive language, and when does it impoverish it? I am a Black writer struggling with and through a language that can powerfully evoke and enforce hidden signs of racial superiority, cultural hegemony, and dismissive othering of people and language, which are by no means marginal or already and completely knowable in my work. And what happens to the writerly imagination of a Black author who is at some level always conscious of representing one's own race to or in spite of a race of readers that understands itself to be universal or race free. In other words, how is literary whiteness and literary blackness made? There are many definitions of the term exploration that adequately describe the purpose of this study, which, according to Merriam-Webster, is to examine, look into, investigate, and to travel over new territory to discover, in the case of this study, perceptions of African American writing in the 21st century. Metaphorically speaking, I considered this study a journey traversing new territory, since there is little scholarly research to use as landmarks or road signs needed to guide me, or studies to use as fuel for a trip with the uncertainty of a final destination. My research questions became my roadmap.